Welcome back to the Poison Podcast. I'm honored to have one of my mentors and someone I gain inspiration from on the show today. Hailing from Seattle, Washington, one of the true godfathers of the Dendro Hobby, Ron Skylstad. Welcome to the podcast, Ron.
Thanks, Josh. Happy to be here.
Awesome. I'm glad to have you on. Well, I'm going to start the show off how I start most of them off, just by asking you how you got into the Dendro Hobby.
How'd they get into the Dendro hobby? I got into it through another hobby, reef keeping, and aquarium keeping, which I was involved in, growing up, but it wasn't until the late 90s that I started getting into saltwater tanks. At that point, in the late 90s, the belief in saltwater was anything less than 40 gallons is not a system that can survive, right? I don't know if you remember this,
Oh, yeah.
10-gallon tanks. People were trying to do 10-gallon reef tanks, now what we call nano tanks. And everyone was like, no, they're just going to crash. They crash too easily. There's not enough water volume. But being a broke college student, I still wanted to keep saltwater. And so got involved in reef keeping. And at that time, this was getting around probably around 2000, early 2000s. It was all discussion boards and forums, Reef Central, reefs.org, those types of places. And Reef Central, I think it was, would do a monthly saltwater aquarium profile where one member would share their tank and all the specs on their tank and what they had in it and what they were lighting it with. And one of those members had a website, and I remember clicking through to their website, and he had a page, and this is an early 2000s like GeoCities style website, and he had a page that said like poison dart frogs or something, like a term. And so I clicked that, and it took me to a page where he showed vivariums set up with frogs and showing the photos of the frogs. And growing up, I'd seen those frogs in books at the library, but I didn't know you could actually keep them. And so it opened up this whole world of, here are these things that I knew existed that always amazed and mystified me as a kid, and we can actually keep them. And I think on there was also a link about ways to find out more. And one of them was a link to a thing called FrogNet, which was an email listserv that you could subscribe to. And it was one giant sort of national email conversation, right? You were always clicking reply all, reply all, reply all. And everyone was involved in this massive email conversation all day, every day about dart frogs. And you could ask questions and people could provide information and that sort of thing. So I was on there for a while just trying to figure out, how do you keep these things? What are the requirements? Where do you get them? Even at that point, you couldn't go to a store and buy them. And then I learned about, well, you got to culture fruit flies, and you got to grow the food to feed them, and you need this kind of tank, and this is how you can and build it. And so I took a while culturing flies and figuring all of that out. And then officially, it was probably around 2002, ended up, I don't even know how I found out they were available at the time, which is where I still live, was in Eastern Washington, which is pretty rural.
Right.
Not in Seattle proper. So there were some people in Seattle keeping dart frogs, but I wasn't connected to them. And so it literally became an issue of getting an email address for someone saying, I see you have these frogs available. I'd like to buy 3 of them. And then you would write a check for
Right.
a decent amount of money and send a check to someone you've never met before and hope within a few days some frogs were going to show up. And I ended up buying a trio of, Santa Isabel Anthonii, and they showed up, and I'd had my tank ready, and I felt like I could keep flies without cultures crashing. And that's how it started.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I kind of skipped over just you introducing yourself and talking about
Oh, yeah.
yourself, but which is fine. But we're just going to go backwards in time.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I know you personally. Like
Yeah.
I was able to luckily meet you while I was living up in Oregon and in Washington. And not everyone knows who you are, even though you did a lot of great things that we'll get into
Right.
later. But yeah, but why don't you introduce yourself, and we'll go backtrack for a second.
Yeah, boy, how do I even start? My name's Ron Skylstad. I've been involved in the hobby for quite a long time now. And at one point, I was the executive director of Tree Walkers International, and the person who also then put on and organized Microcosm, which was sort of a subsect event of Tree Walkers International. Tree Walkers International was an amphibian conservation organization that was grassroots, volunteer-led, volunteer-driven, and it was a nonprofit that worked to conserve amphibians and their habitat, not just tropical ones or neotropical ones, but native ones as well. And Microcosm then became, in a sense, the fundraising event for that. And then we were involved in various conservation projects, and then awarded micro grants to people doing novel types of conservation for amphibians that maybe big organizations wouldn't see, or it wasn't in some sexy place like Madagascar or whatever. It's someone in Wyoming dealing with a species of frog that's not really on the radar, and they want to try RNA detection in the water to try to get better idea of assessing if they're present or not, in a place. And so we do micro grants to help with a summer field study or something like that.
Yeah, I want
And we
people
had
to know
some
that Microcosms was amazing. I was able to go to 2 events, one of
okay,
which you invited Stu, my old business partner, and I
that's
to
right.
actually go down to Balboa Park and not vend, but have a table there. And
Have a
it
table.
was my first experience, other than our Pacific Northwest Vivarium Society, to be around a group of
Yeah.
like-minded individuals and be surrounded with just dart frogs
Yeah.
and some other, plants and other things too. But it was my first time actually being around that, and it was
Oh,
mind-blowing
interesting.
for
I
me at
didn't
the
know
time.
that. Right.
Yeah, mind-blowing
Yeah.
for me at the time. Yeah,
Microcosm.
2014, I believe, was when you had it in Balboa Park down in San Diego.
I
If I
think so.
might be off.
2013, 2014. The first
Yeah,
microcosm, maybe I should back up a little bit to talk about how all this happened. But
I would.
okay. So I get into the dart frog hobby, and I'm on FrogNet. And like I said, the way you engaged with people was purely verbally, because at this point a lot of people still had dial-up internet, or maybe they had DSL, right? It wasn't quick, it wasn't fast. So you couldn't attach images, and digital photography was just becoming a thing. So not everybody had, a digital camera to be able to take photos of things. So you weren't sending photos of what you had. And I think about this a lot, and where the hobby has gone and where it's at now. And we can talk about this more later. I think the medium actually influences the message and what that message is. And I think because FrogNet was email based, and it was words, it was narrative, it was conversation, it actually required dialogue and discussion. And at the time, you had a lot of people from the zoological backgrounds, or biologists, or just sort of people like me who were deeply interested in natural history and ecology and wanted to know more about these things. So we were talking beyond just how do you take care of frogs? How do we keep them alive in a whatever gallon tank? How do we breed them? It was what are the ecosystems and habitats these things come from? How do we, and because their natural history and their life cycle is so tied to that ecology, to certain plants, to certain climates, how do we recreate those factors in this system? So it was a very ecological approach, more than just, kind of the got to catch them all. I got them all. I got everyone,
Yep.
which we all have a little bit of that collectoritis, right? You see,
Oh
oh,
yeah,
I like this. I like this. I like
it's
this.
like
It's just,
Pokemon.
right. The diversity is amazing, but it was an approach that was even more, okay, beyond this. How do we go? How do we get something bigger? At the time, usually the biggest thing was a 55-gallon tank that someone was keeping, and everything was aquarium based. There was no off the shelf enclosure that you could use. It was all
No.
modifying aquariums, right?
Yeah.
And so that was kind of what the hobby was all about. And being where I lived was a rural area in Eastern Washington. I was on my own. There wasn't a community. There weren't hobbyists I could go over and see their frog room or their collection of their frogs. And so this began on FrogNet. And at a certain point, you start to get to know the people who post more than others, and start to see their voices. And at the time for me, that was people like Brent Brock, Tor Linbo, Tracy Hicks. These started to be the voices you would hear more and more often, and then maybe send an email off to the side and be like, okay, rather than reply all, let's just reply and say, okay, you mentioned this. How are you working with this? At one point, Brent put out an announcement that they were starting a thing called TWI, Tree Walkers International, which was pulled from the genus Dendrobates, which means tree walker. and it was a grassroots amphibian conservation initiative. And they had created a website, and you could become a member, and then you got access to the member discussion forum. And those at that point, Dendro Board, I think, had launched at that point, and the idea of a discussion forum was becoming more and more popular. And that was around 2003, I think.
Yeah, I think Dendro Board was 2003 or 2004, somewhere right there.
Yeah, somewhere in there. And there were even announcements there saying, "Hey, can you guys come over and participate in the discussion forum over here? Take a break from FrogNet once in a while and kind of help seed some conversations over here." So we would do that. And then somewhere in that was this announcement for TWI. And so I became a member and got involved. And there was a forum that said, or a post that said, "Introduce yourself." So I introduced myself, said where I was, and at that point, Todd Kelly and Christina Hansen popped up, and they're like, "Oh, hey, we're just a couple hours away from you. Like next time you're over, stop by. We should get to know each other, because it's good just to have people who are in close proximity to you, kind of in the hobby." And so I was, okay, great, that's fantastic. Volunteered. Then they called for volunteers for TWI, and I said, "I'd love to volunteer. I don't know what I can do, but I'm open to helping as I can." And at the time, they wanted to start a newsletter, and they needed someone to design it and put it together. And I said, "I'd be happy to do that. I can edit whatever." I think it started as a newsletter, but by the end of the conversation, it became a magazine.
Ooh, are we leading into leaf litter?
We're now in leaf litter. Yeah.
Okay.
And Brett, I swear they said they were looking for an editor to edit a member magazine. Brent swears it was a newsletter, and I'm the one who came up with the magazine idea. That's a disagreement we had. I was like, "No, you asked for a magazine." He's like, "No, we asked for a newsletter. You turned it into a magazine." Either way, we were happy with the result. But yeah, at some point in there, I said, I've never done this before. And they said, "Well, we'll get you like Adobe InDesign. Can you just teach yourself how to use it and then go from there?" I was like, "Yeah, fine. That works." And so that was and I still had not met any of these people in person, but again, it's this regular daily interaction that's happening. And so I started Leaf Litter Magazine. And there was a Northwest Frog Fest happening. And this is all probably around 2004, 2005. There was a Northwest Frog Fest happening. Brent was from Montana, and he was going to come over and have a TWI info table so people could see some of the work that TWI had been doing. And I said, "Well, I'm going to go." And he said, "Will you man the TWI table with me?" And Todd and Christina said, "Well, you both can just stay at our house while you're here." Again, I've never met any of these people before in my life. And they're like, "Well, you can just stay at our house and we'll go do this event." And so I go to Northwest Frog Fest, and it was the first time I had met any of these people in real life. At the time it was Ed's Fly Meat and Black Jungle. Mike and Richard from Black Jungle were there, and AZDR was there. And it was all these people who I'd been to their websites, but for the first time got to have actual conversations with them. And it changed everything. Some of those people are still my closest friends, that I'll text or talk to on a regular basis. When I go on Facebook and I want to see what's happening in people's lives, those people I met that night are still the ones at the top of my feed, because over time, even though it was these frogs and glass boxes that brought us together, you click with certain people and realize, okay, it's bigger than just this. And that's where I felt like there was an actual community in the hobby. It wasn't just a bunch of people keeping animals. There was a sense of community, because even at the time it was small enough. You knew a lot of the people who were involved. So where do we go from there? Oh, microcosm. So that was actually, I believe there was one more Northwest Frog Fest after that. And there was Northwest Frog Fest and Midwest Frog Fest, NWFF and MWFF. And they would alternate like every other year and bounce between the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest. After that, there was one more Northwest Frog Fest, and they said, "Okay, we're going to be done. We're not going to plan this anymore." And after that event, I hop in a car with Brent and Todd and Tor, and we're talking about, "Oh, this was great. This was fun." And then it was like, let's stop at a fish store before we get home. Let's just see what's at the fish store. And then I think Todd was like, "Well, the Orchid Society show is in a couple months. Maybe you guys can all come back and we'll go to that." Well, and then 2 weeks after that is the Hardy Fern Society show, and maybe we could do that and get ferns. And someone made the comment about, what if we could just have all these events at the same time under one roof, and everything we're interested in could just happen at once? And we basically said, if we could just have like a glass box conference, naturalistic hobbies, that would be fantastic. And I think by the end of that car ride, we basically started planning what became Microcosm. And the idea was, let's take these glass box hobbies that are fish, that are frogs, that are plants, that are natural history, scientific, ecological approach to all of them, and all of these small little things, let's bring them all together and see what sort of cross-pollination and overlap can happen. So we did the very first microcosm. Boy, it might have been 2008, 2009.
I think so.
I just remember it happened like 6 months after the financial collapse.
Yeah.
And everyone said it was both the best and worst event they'd ever been to, because the sheer number of people we brought together for that from
Yeah.
all these different interests, and nobody had any money to, to buy or sell or anything like that. So there was kind of a typical show that it revolved around, but we didn't want it to all be about that. We wanted to be about, let's encourage wonder and let's learn about things we don't know about. And so bring speakers in that talk about animals, not many of us know about. And so I think for that first one, we brought in John Simmons, who was a museum collection specialist. He'd spent, I think his college years or his master's years as the assistant to Duhlman, Bill Duhlman, driving around through South America in a camper, locating all these animals. And then after that, we brought Mark Pepper in, which I think now, at least at the time, this idea of understory enterprises was this novel thing, like that this guy is going to Peru and he's collecting frogs and he's breeding frogs down there, and then he's got to get all the permits to bring them back up to Canada, and he's got to rebreed everything up in Canada so you have Canadian stock and then put it out to the hobby. I think that's just, and to have that much diversity and access to so much stuff, we take it for granted. But at the time, like it hadn't really been done. There was Inibico before that, where you get some stuff in. I think when I entered the hobby, getting all these cool imitator in was the big thing.
Yeah. And they're
and
still around too. They're still doing their
are they
thing.
still making
Yeah,
stuff?
I think
Awesome.
them, Wakiri, and now Tesoro. There's still quite a few people.
Right. And so those are still doing it, and they're doing great, but it was really, under, and at the time, a lot of people didn't know who Mark was. Who's this guy? What's he doing? Like, why isn't he just putting out frogs? So we basically said, Mark, will you show up and just tell us the story about how you built this whole thing and what's happening and what you're doing? And so he got to come and talk about all that. And we held it all at a hotel, within a hotel, so people could just be there and interact with each other. And so we had speakers and we had workshops, and then we had a fundraising auction and all of that. So all that to say, there's a big long answer. That was the first microcosm. And because of the economic climate at the time, everyone was, and we had plant people there to the degree that plant people weren't usually at these things. And so because of the economic thing, we decided, let's take a couple years, take a break from it. That was a lot. And then we thought, well, let's do it again. And somehow, I think because Mike Reedy is down in San Diego, he said, well, I'll help you plan it and work with the venue if you want to put it on down here, because Southern California has a big, we got plants, a lot of fish, a lot of herps societies and hobbyists. So what if we put it on down here? So we did the same thing, but we put it down there, and then we kind of partnered with the San Diego Zoo next door and had them put on talks during the day, and then we had the show, and it was a bigger venue, and we did that, and that was great. That was successful. And then we did again the following year, and it got big, and it kind of getting bigger, and planning something from another state that far away just got to be really difficult and complicated. Yeah. So we hit the brakes on it, and then we brought it back up to Seattle. And at that point, it was the tail was starting to wag the dog a little bit, to where it was like it was becoming more of a vendor show, and we never wanted that to be the pure emphasis. We always wanted there to be this component where you're learning and there's talks and you get a chance to remember that this was a hobby.
Right.
And so we brought it back to Seattle and we pared it down, rented like a little lab room at UW and made it much, much smaller, to where we didn't even have a vendor show component. It was just some talks and presentations throughout the day. And then we created what we called, at the end of all that, we'd get pizza and dinner and bring that all in, and beer and drinks. And then we'd have what we called the collector's tables, and people brought what they wanted to sell. And then we'd have a time where they could just put it out on the tables, and then everyone had to leave the room, and we put it all out there, and everything was priced and had the person's name on it. And then based on your ticket number from when you signed up for the event, you were allowed in groups of 5. And I think we gave people 5 minutes or 10 minutes, I don't remember, to grab up to 2 things, and then you'd have to leave, and then the next group of 5 would come in numerically, and it created this like almost supermarket sweep of like, what's in here? What's in here? I don't have to. Oh, there's fish in a bag. Oh, there's frogs over here. Oh, there's a plant. What is this? Where did this come from? It's this book, and then we would just cycle through until everything was gone, basically bought, and then everyone would settle up with everybody, and then after that we do an actual live fundraising auction, which is where everyone's flush with cash at that point, and we would do a live auction, and all of that would then go to fundraise, help put on the next event, and then be awarded out through grants. We did that the last one we were going to do was 2020, and then COVID hit, and so we didn't put that one on, and then it went to sleep for the last 5 or 6 years.
I like
And
the idea of what you were talking about originally, like when you guys scaled it back down, because it reminds me a lot of, I hate to go back to the marine hobby, but they started something that kind of spanned from MACNA, which was their huge,
oh yes, right,
that was their huge event, and
yep,
the I guess people wanted to do the same thing, scale it back. So now they're doing something called Reef Retreat, which is almost
okay,
exactly what you're talking about, where like-minded individuals that want to learn a little bit more than just the average person get together. They have talks, they have,
yep,
lectures. They do a little bit of like trade, this and that. It's not really a vending thing. They host it at a academic. I can't remember what college it's at. It's in Rhode Island. It's on a bay in a college, and everyone
oh, okay,
stays in the
yeah,
dormitory.
yeah,
It's you pay one fee, you get all your food for free, everything. It's all catered, and it's just
that's a
such an
yeah,
amazing idea. I would love to
yeah,
do something like that, especially with the acreage we have now in upstate.
oh,
I'd love
yeah,
to have a get together, and
yeah,
I'd also like to see microcosms come back someday, because I think that the groundwork was laid for something that was way ahead of its time, because there are things going on like American Frog Day, which is amazing, but it
yeah,
is just purely a vendor show.
right,
You go there, you look at what you want to buy, you buy it, you leave. They do have speakers. I think Ivan from Tesauras has spoken there. There's been
yeah,
speakers, but that realistically you might get like 2 speakers, and then the rest of it's just, we're spending. Which
yeah, right,
I
right,
still love
yeah,
it. We all get together, but having something like what you created, because I was able to meet so many people um in the 2 shows I went to, that I didn't know that they weren't just there, like on the West Coast. There was people coming in from all over, and I'm
oh, we
finding
had
that out
people
even
who
now.
would come to everyone from New York, from the East
Yeah,
Coast,
I
from
mean, I
Florida,
even
where
went talking
yeah,
to Julio Rodriguez. He's like, "Oh yeah, I was over there, and I was a fly on the wall." I'm like, "I don't even remember seeing you there."
right?
It's like
And
hiding in the
it was
corner
the only time a
somewhere.
lot of them would come west of the Mississippi.
Yeah, yeah,
So it was a very honoring thing, but what we did, and I got burned out doing the vendor show thing and felt like this is not why we started this. And I think when we reimagined it and did the last couple in Seattle, I didn't know it at the time, but how I describe it now was, let's create an event. Let's create 2 days. And we would take field trips and, do all these things, go to see behind the scenes at Woodland Park Zoo or the Spheres. I think the last year we went to the Spheres and did a tour before they had even opened of everything they were growing in the greenhouses. And it was amazing to see all that. But I think the purpose of it was, let's force us to be hobbyists and just hobbyists. Because what I saw in the hobby, and I think has been something I've struggled with in regard to what the experience of being in the hobby was when I first started, to what it's become now, and partly, and I'll say this, I'll say this after I say this. Okay, a lot of it became, everyone was suddenly a business, right? To be a hobbyist meant you were now a business,
it's
and
there's so much truth in that statement.
and I think social media kind of, I'll say, ruined a lot of it, to where all of a sudden everyone could have their own page, and
Yep,
I'm a mini store. And to be involved in the hobby meant being a mini business. And
yep,
that's not why I get into the hobby, and that's not why we have hobbies. And so when I hear people talk about, well, I just spent this much money on a frog, so I got to breed them as fast as possible to turn them around to recoup that money. And I was like, well, that's not why I'm in the hobby.
right,
I participate in a hobby, or I want these things in my life and my daily experience because they enrich it somehow. And what vivariums are to me are doorways and portals into an understanding of a part of the world that I'm fascinated with, but don't get to be in or have access to all the time. So that to me is, they enrich my life. And
right.
so in the early days, when I was telling my wife I'm writing a check for this much money and just sending them off to some guy in Seattle, She's like, "What?" I never thought I was gonna recoup that money. That was money I was willing to spend to have this thing in my life and to be in the presence of this thing on a regular basis. At some point, there was a shift to where it was like, "No, it's just all commerce. Like, I bought these, I gotta flip them, or I gotta do this and this and this, and then it's about this." And I think that's where I talked about the other thing I was gonna say, the medium influences the message and what's being talked about. And I think once we hit discussion forums where people could post images, um, it started getting really photo heavy, and I'll say the depth and substance of the conversation started to decline a little bit. It
Yeah.
became about the wow factor of, "Oh, you have that frog? Oh, you did this?" Or,
Yeah.
"Oh, you've got these in your collection? Can we see more photos of what's in your collection?" And then when we hit social media, it just kind of went way off to the side
It
as
did.
far as my experience of what it was all about. And I would go to shows and just see, just the quality of the frogs that were on the tables, these little skeleton froglets that seemed like they shouldn't. I mean, you got to rear them up a little bit more.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me like it was all just about like cranking through
Oh
stuff
yeah.
or trying to get stuff out there too quickly at maybe sometimes the animal's expense. And I just didn't love seeing that. Or it was about posting things for likes, and this discussion of, especially with our involvement with TWI and what we were trying to do there was a disconnect and even just a lack of interest about where these things even came from.
Yeah.
And what is this thing called the rainforest? And why are they even this color? And why did they even evolve to get that way? That wasn't an interest. It was like, look what I got, look what I got, look what I got, look what I got. And that just didn't interest me. And so the last several years, I've been dealing with this feeling of distance and disconnect with the hobby because the way we have to engage with it now is largely on social media. And that just isn't fulfilling to me. That's not interesting to me.
I think
Yeah,
talking to some of my European friends, especially in Germany, people like Rudd, over at Dutch Rana and just a lot of people over there that I've met.
yeah,
I got a different view of why it became so popular over there, and kind of like what you said, it's a doorway into something. It's
yeah,
over there. What I gathered is as much as they like keeping frogs, it's also a way for them to add beauty into a small area of their house, and they would rather have a 400-gallon or a whole entire wall vivarium showcasing plants from the rainforest and maybe one frog, and
yep,
that's it. And now I'm not saying there isn't collectors, there's still people, but
right,
I
right,
I see
yeah,
it I see it put together in a way, and what drew me into it, um, was the plants and the biotope is just as important as the animals you're keeping, and they both
yes,
have to be able to cohabitate in order to create this, this beauty. Like the frogs need the bromeliad to breed, and this and that. Like you said, like early on, us figuring out how to even keep these
right,
animals. There's something about that that makes it very special. The frogs are definitely number one for me, but everything coincides together. It all makes it's all
yeah,
harmony. Whether and I
yep,
feel like this hobby has always been biotope driven, and I feel
yes,
like
I think so.
and I think some of it's been lost. I think people are kind of drifting a little bit here and there. I see a lot of things getting scaled back down, which is kind of sad because I feel like that's not the direction. I think
Scale down and what, like, people are
scaled
selling their
down like now,
collections off?
like when I first got into the hobby, the standard was a certain size,
Oh, right,
and stuff like that. I feel like people are scaling back, people are penny pinching,
yeah,
people are putting the frogs front and center before everything else, and I think that there's a culmination of things that have to come together to make it work out, perfectly, and for the frogs to benefit from the way
yeah,
we're keeping them. Because like I told you earlier before we started the show, when I first
yeah,
got into this, just the reptile hobby and amphibian hobby in general, when we first started bringing in frogs in the early 90s, we were keeping them in aquariums with fish tank gravel,
Right.
little to no plants, maybe like you said, like a thing of pothos.
Slope, so you'd have a pond, right?
Yeah, just something
Because it's a
ridiculous that
frog, so it
doesn't
needs a pond, right?
something that doesn't even resemble nature. It has nothing to do with where they're from. It was literally just so we could keep these frogs alive long enough to sell to somebody to kill. And
Yes.
and and and,
Right.
and that's the reality of the situation.
And
And
this is the early part of the hobby, which I would say is the 90s, maybe late 80s, but a good chunk of the 90s, this hobby was built on people who were figuring that out
that's
at
it was
I'll say
the
sometimes
golden
great
years.
financial risk and cost,
But
because
it was the golden years, and it was happening quick. It was happening
yes.
real quick. I mean, I don't think, and this is why I said I take a lot of inspiration from a lot of you guys in Seattle, Tor Limbo, Steve Waldron, you, Todd Kelly and his wife Christina, because it was the first time I ever saw a vivarium done how I would consider as correct as possible. Because we had
Mm.
vivariums even before I met you, but it was
Right.
very basic.
Yeah.
And when I went up to Seattle and met you guys for the first time, when we all kind of culminated and started the PNW, the Pacific Northwest Vivarium Society, that's the first time I ever saw it done correctly, like an actual biotope that was specific to the habitat of that animal, not just I'm going to throw a bunch of plants in from the rainforest. It was like, no, this frog is from Colombia, and all these plants are
Right.
from Colombia. And furthermore, what I'd like to show at some point, we won't see it because I'll add it
Yeah.
in. But I
Yeah.
took a lot of inspiration from some of your vivariums because you did have
Mm.
some very biospecific or specific
Well,
vivariums well, I saw pictures that you had showed. This is exactly where I'm duplicating this
yes.
specific vivarium, and
Yeah.
it really was reminiscent of almost a mono in a way,
Right.
or any lifelike biotopes like with the fish. I gain a lot from that because I think they were
Yeah.
some of the forefront of doing biotopes, but you guys were some of the first I saw doing that.
And I would say that comes back to being ecologically natural history minded. Even a mono, I mean, I think I've got his biography right behind me. As idealistic and fanciful as he sometimes planted and approach takes, if you look tanks, when you look at a lot of his early stuff, he was
Slice.
trying
Slice of
yeah,
the
it was like
riverbank.
a slice of nature is what he was trying to recreate. And the way he got there was observation. I mean, that guy swam and snorkeled in rice paddies growing up as a kid in the country. And so he had, and I did similar stuff. In my hometown, had a creek that ran right through the middle of town. And so I would spend my days growing up observing, where plant roots come out of the ground and go into the pools, and how rocks set themselves up in flow, and where the fish tend to hang out. So again, I very much come from this idea of I want to recreate that in my living room, not just have an animal. But even a mono said, if we put these fish in a glass box full of water and plants, and they still aren't acting normally and behaviorally as they would in the wild, we haven't yet succeeded. And I think that in the dart frog hobby you had in the 90s, and then kind of from 2000, 2010, 2020, you have these phases to where the beginning part was, can we just keep them alive?
Yep.
Right? You're not just selling them to die in
Mhm.
someone's place 6 weeks later because they come in starving and beat up from shipping.
Parasites,
Um,
everything.
right, parasite ridden, all these types of things. Can we keep them alive? Can we get them healthy and just get them alive? And then it was, well, can we breed them? Can we get to them healthy enough and feeling comfortable enough and in a natural enough display that they'll breed? And then after that, well, now can we breed them? I'll use Tinctorius as an example. People I've talked to who've seen them in the wild, and they said, I have never seen a captive bred Tinctorius of the size as they are in the wild. So to me, that then says, well, that's a care issue, something
Yeah,
we're missing because captive bred animals are not reaching what they are in the wild.
sure.
So there's always these phases we can build on. And I think a lot of us understood that we were working towards something there. And the enclosure, what we keep them in, was part of that. I think the frogs are the easiest thing.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
right.
exactly.
It's frogs don't need air movement. Plants do,
Right.
epiphytes do. And there's all these, I spend more time taking care of fruit flies still. I mean, I still make my own fruit fly cultures with the same recipe I got from a website called Doyle's Dart Den that I think Christina Hansen developed. And every week I still mash up bananas and applesauce and oatmeal and
Uh-huh.
add a little bit of vinegar. And I start my mason jar fruit fly cultures. Again, the fruit flies get more attention than the frogs do, but the frogs are the easy part, but there's all these components we have to create to do that. And as an attachment to that, I mean, going back to FrogNet and very early Dendro board, because we had the conversation in both those places, was Brent and Matt Mirabello, who like now has his PhD. He'll hear this and say, no, you got it wrong. We call him Dr. Dirt, but his PhD was in like soil biology. So Brent, being an ecologist and biologist, and Matt, we would all have this conversation of how can we create nutrient poor clay-based soil like in the rainforest so that the plants grow like they do in the rainforest.
Yeah.
Because at that point, we were creating these utopian lush ideals. But when you see dart frogs in their native habitat, they're in a bunch of dead leaves 99% of the time, right? It's not anything that looks like a botanical garden. So can we strike a balance and figure that out? Also, this idea of, well, we want these plants to have this nutrient-rich soil so we get all this amazing growth, but in small enclosures, that's a pain in the butt because you're always trimming things back. And so Brent's whole thing was, if we create nutrient poor substrate with this interaction at the surface with invertebrates and leaf litter and all these things, and plants are all competing for those nutrients, we'll still have good looking plants. They just won't grow gangbusters. And we can seed these things that will hopefully reproduce within the tank. And the frogs can have supplemental feeding in between our feedings. And so there was this whole, it's probably still out there, maybe, this whole conversation that we had for like a year and a half of trying to create clay-based neotropical soil. And Matt had an experimental tank running, and Brent had an experimental tank running. I had an experimental tank running. And it was the least amount I ever fed my frogs. And it was like the fattest they ever were in these tanks that were just full of all this stuff. They were heavy as hell to move if you ever had to, because it is just clay. But again, this goes back to, let's understand the ecology. Let's create these things, these principles that play out within the enclosure. And then the frogs are just going to follow suit. The frogs are going to be able to be
I think I
more what it
remember
is.
talking. It was either I think it was Justin Yeager that I talked to about, how a lot of this stuff came about, and he had conversation. I believe it was him. I might be wrong, but anyways, either way, it doesn't matter. The conversation with the person I was talking to was basically how this all came about, and it was a team of herpetologists that had been over. I don't think they were in Panama. I think they were somewhere else, but they were starting to create data, and it was for the zoological field over in Europe, or the the herpetologist over there.
Yeah.
They were starting to create data, and it was basically like barometric pressures, the breeding season cycles, temperature swings day and night, and they would
Rain.
go there, not
Yeah.
to, they wouldn't even
Temperature
find,
drops.
yeah, they wouldn't even find the frogs to picture the frogs. They would find the frogs just to start taking this data, and
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
where they're found. Are they found high in the canopy, low in the canopy? Are they found on the forest floor? And then they started, doing this, and now it's like, man, this is like the most vital information. And I think that a lot of it isn't, I think it's just knowledge that's been passed.
Yeah.
I used to be able to find some old, I don't know if they were like essays that were written. I've got them somewhere, but it's for a specific frog, and I believe it wasn't even Dendrobates. I think it's for a toad species or something. But I just remember seeing them cataloging this data and being like, well, that's exactly, they wrote the book on this, and it makes so much more sense, and why it took so long, because like I said, I never saw a recreation, and we're still learning too, by the way, because I had this conversation with Julio when I had him on, just talking about redheads in situ, how we've been keeping them in these saturated systems, and they're in this like uber dry environment,
They're
which
getting
leads
baked on
me
a
into
hillside. Yeah.
which leads me into my next question for you, and it's something that I ask everybody, guests that have been in situ. I'd like to ask you about what your time in situ was like, because I've watched, or not watched, I was there for your talk that you gave on some of your trips that you had. I'd love for people to hear about some of what you saw in situ, and what it was like was it saturated wet like we keep our tanks damp, or was it dry as a bone orchard fields like I hear a lot of these frogs people find?
Yeah. Boy. And I've been to both Costa Rica and different parts of Peru.
Yep.
And there are dry seasons, there are wet seasons, there's that can activate breathing and all that kind of stuff. I think what I realized the first time I went, and the first time I went was Costa Rica, which was after SACUS, which was the South American Conservation Amphibian Symposium. I could be getting that wrong. Richard will let me know if so. But it was held in Costa Rica, and again, it brought all these people together from around the world who'd never been in the same room before. And after that, it was the first time I'd ever been in a neotropical environment. And Brent came down, and we went down to represent TWI, and we said, you know what, let's go road tripping down the Pacific side of Costa Rica. This was held in Siquirres, on the Caribbean side, the Atlantic side. And he said, let's tack on a few days. Let's go see if we can find granulifera afterwards. And we'll rent a car and we'll just road trip down the coast of Costa Rica. This is in summer of 2013. And I didn't really know Spanish. He didn't really know Spanish, but we were like, we'll figure it out. And so after the conference is over, we go back to the airport, and at the airport, we're getting a rental car, and Ed Smith from the Smithsonian, Ed Smith comes up with Ed Tuggle, and Ed's like, what are you guys doing? You guys heading home? We're like, no, we've tacked on a few extra days, and we're going to go road trip down and see if we can find some frogs. And Ed's like, you got room in the car? And we're like, yeah, you want to come along? He's like, yeah, I got time to kill, because he had to go like on a tour down in South America. He was leading a tour for the Smithsonian or something. So Ed and they jumped in, and then the four of us road tripped. And thank goodness, because Ed actually knew Spanish. I don't know what we would have done, me and Brent, if we hadn't. Yeah, but we'd been given some clues by people who trusted us to go out in these areas, and knew we just wanted to observe and photograph. So we ended up going and seeing, and at the time it was funny because people would talk about granulifera, and they're like, "Oh, it's such an amazing frog," and I was like, "It's fine." I was very focused on my stream frogs from Ecuador, but something shifted, to answer your question in a very long way, when you see those things in nature for the first time, and you see a granulifera in its habitat, and then it's those colors, and to hear the stream behind you, and to see water dripping off the leaves, and it's just going about doing its thing, shifted something inside me to where I was like, oh, it really is a part of this. And this idea that we could pull it out and put it in a vacuum of a glass box, I think I realized there's so much more potential for what we do in that glass box, but also how big. I mean, right? We put a frog in what? Let's say a 3-foot tank, and it takes 2 hops for it to get to the other side of that tank. And I'm like, that's not even the size of the base of plant I saw this granulifera in. And so I guess it was this sense of responsibility to, if I'm going to take these things on and have them in my possession, I'm responsible to try to create something as close to where they come from as possible. Going back to what Omano said, if they're not acting naturally, we still haven't done our job. It's not successful. And there was this moment to where Brent and I are looking at this granulifera, and at the base of the plant, a Rotis is hopping around, like 2.5 feet away from it. And then I walk 30 feet away over to the stream bank, and I hop down on the stream, and there's a Vitatus hopping along the stream bank. And so within the span of a distance that I could easily, have thrown a rock back at where I was, I see these 3 frog species together. Yeah. And to me, that became this Costa Rican trifecta of like, wow, to see these things here, to see a Vitatus in the wild, and the way the light hits that orange fleck, that actual sunlight hits a Vitatus, that thing looked more amazing than any of the Vitatus I'd born or reared and raised, in captivity. And then I came back like, I want to just breed amazing Vitatus. And you come back and realize what an amazing animal that is, because it's hanging out, at least the one I saw was hanging out under this undercut sort of bank. And so you don't see it except for this glint of orange, when the light hits it. And so it's so cryptic except for when it's not. And so again, this came, talking about in situ, Brent had created this clay-based soil, which is interesting because now I see it for sale. People are like making it and selling it, and you can buy it and put it in your tank. They probably don't know this started on a crazy conversation between 2 ecologists, over email 20 years ago. But Brent's picking up clumps of the clay, and he's like, I think we got close.
No, I remember him doing the breakdown analysis and stuff on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we use it for they're using it for everything now. They're using it for
Yeah.
springtail cultures. They're using it for calcium clay mineral baths for frogs. They're using it
Well, and
for
even that went back to specific things Ed Kowalski said. He's like, how much calcium is actually in the clay, or could we inject into the clay so
yeah,
that if the mites and the springtails and the things are, or if even the frogs themselves are indirectly ingesting the clay when they go for prey, that can help create just a more diverse diet for these frogs. And so it was really about how can we create as much diversity as possible in these enclosures. So going back to your question, it, on one hand, and I remember asking Devin Edmonds this when he went into the rainforest, I think on the first understory tour, and came back and I said, "What insight has it given you?" And one of the things he said was, "I realized we can't even get close." What right?
where
Whatever we
every
do,
herpetologist I've talked to says we're still scratching the surface.
we're still scratching the surface, and I feel with what we came into now in the current period of look what I got, look what I got, look what I got.
Yeah.
It's become even less so that we're trying to get to that next like thing. And even going again, harping on what Omano said and thinking about reef keeping. And I realized, at least at the time, when people would aquascape their aquarium, that consisted of just stacking live rock flat against the
Yep.
back wall. And what I realized was, compared to seeing photos, fish are just swimming back and forth in front of a wall. Whereas when I went to then Hawaii the first time and I'm snorkeling, I realized they're swimming above the reef,
Yep.
right? They're
They're
interacting with all these elements.
rolling in the shoals.
It's
They're
oh my
yeah.
gosh, it's this whole three-dimensional space, and we're giving them a
Yep.
wall to swim back and forth in front of. Like, they can't
Yeah.
even get into the rock to feel a sense of safety because they have to stay in front of it all the time. So
Yeah.
it's just stuff like that to learn these things, behaviors, and what they do and what they need. So
I
yeah,
think there's a lot of there is a lot of new science. There's a lot of people that are trying to come up with new products. I feel like we finally have equalized between Europe and America. I feel like
yeah,
the Europeans were on the cusp and we finally equalized and we're playing off of each other now.
yeah.
I think that there definitely is a lot to be said about dietary needs. That's probably one of I think we've got a lot of the plants down at this point, at least enough. Like maybe not to your degree. You're like, let's take it further. I mean, there's always let's take everything further. Let's inoculate the tanks with
Oh,
with
well,
fungi
and
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 stuff.
if I could
Let's do
throw this in
everything.
as a side, I mean, me and Brent were throwing everything in there. And I think the reason our soil was so successful was because we threw earthworms in there, and the earthworms created tunnels through the clay
Sure.
that act as refugiums that the insects could get away from. And springtails were reproducing within those tunnels and then feeding,
Oh yeah.
what the frogs could get at. But
There's people out on the
it
market
was
now. I think frogdaddy.com has a mycelium that you can buy
right, right.
that's made up of,
And we would
you know
go, I mean, Brent, his whole thing, what we do is go underneath a pine tree or a fir tree, grab a chunk of soil, smell it, and if it kind of smells mushroomy, well, we just throw that in the tank. And that's how we were inoculating our tanks. And we knew it was an experiment, but I will say there was this point at which, coming back from Costa Rica, the highest concentrations of Pamelio I saw were literally in literal piles of garbage, which the highest concentration of Aratus I ever saw was in an old semi truck tire that had collected
that's
mosquitoes and
that's
water and nut
that's funny
husks.
you say that. The first time I saw Aratus, well, not in their native in situ, but in Hawaii, they were at a open air Thai food restaurant, and there was
Yes.
a stack of tires behind it, and you probably know
Yep.
where I'm talking about, and
Oh
they were
yeah.
everywhere back there in the tires and garbage, and they were
Like
breeding
yeah,
in the
yeah. There,
tires.
and I came back and people got mad because I was calling them trash frogs, and they're like, no, they're literally trash frogs, like because you have so many deposition sites, right? If you got a thing full of old beer cans that are collecting water, all of a sudden those are amazing deposition sites. So I came back from that and I started collecting old rusty trash, and in my Pamelio and Aratus tanks. I was like, well, if we're really going to be biotopically correct, I started putting pieces of garbage in it, and plants were going over it, and I posted those photos on Dendro board, and I have never received so much hate
I
as
was
when
just
I
gonna say.
as when I posted those. I had people DMing me. They were like, "How dare you And they were like, "That's gonna harm the frogs. They're gonna get an infection." And I was like, "From what? Like,
This is how
tetanus?
literally
They're
the
not."
Pasamento's red frog beach frog was saved, was from the garbage they left after building and almost wiping the population out by building the giant, huge, hotel on there, whatever.
Exactly. These are, at least some of them are highly adaptable species that, I mean, all of a sudden, here's all these deposition sites. They don't know what's natural or what's not natural.
No.
I thought it was a fun thing to do. No, it offended so many people to do that. But there's other things too that when we talk about, being in situ, one of the things I've come to realize is when you go down, and I tend, because I love streams and I love riparian habitats,
Yeah.
when you go down into a stream, it drops and there's a cooling effect from that stream and from the water. And so, whereas literally I could be up on the bank here and it feels warm and I could scramble down 10 feet into the stream, it's actually much cooler there. And I think I've actually struggled keeping Camellia. Because I think where I live in the eastern side of the Cascades, it's just really cold. It's cold.
Yep.
It's cooler, but all these riparian species of frogs that associate with streams, I do really well with. I've
Migra
bred
and
really
things
well
like that.
because it's cooler temperatures. And I would throw the windows open on my frog room, and the temperature would get down into the 50s at night. And frogs would go crazy
Yeah.
when that temperature drop would hit. So it's stuff like that. And then we talk about technology and where we're at. With lighting, that was a difficult thing in the hobby because I think in Japan and Europe they had great lighting, but here we were still dealing with fluorescent tubes and screw-in
T5s,
power
I think.
compact bulbs.
Yeah, T5s and
But one thing
compact.
Brent started to notice, and Ed wrote some articles about this for Leaf Litter, Ed Kowalski, was how amphibians metabolize carotenoids and vitamin A. And Alan Rapace has done a lot. Supplements were another really difficult thing. Up before that, we had to use like superprene that's for parrots and things like that for them to
Yeah.
get calcium. But Alan Rapace's done a lot as far as this and looking at the science. But one thing Brent started experimenting with was actual UV, I think UVB exposure. So he was using a UV light bulb over his tank, over his Blue Jeans Pamilio from the 90s. And I have never seen frogs that red before like they are in nature because whatever it was, the UVB was allowing them to metabolize things, and that coloration, I think, is a signifier of
This
their
is
health.
this is
And
an
I would then
ongoing.
apply this to a lot of other species,
Yeah.
not all of them, but probably silver stonii that's from a very high elevation. I would say tricolor anthonii that live in these gullies that get a lot of sun, probably larger obligate egg feeders. I think if they got regular exposure to UVB, we wouldn't have, I think we would just be much more successful with
This
them.
is an ongoing conversation with all the old heads, is that
Yeah,
this is, well, it's funny. This is a conversation we already had. It's a conversation that for some
right.
reason got
That we
lost.
had 18
Um,
years ago, 15 years
yeah,
ago.
because like I said, I had Julio on just a little bit ago, and he's running UVB on all of his tanks.
Yep.
Now
Yep.
the exposure rate is different because, I've only been down to Costa Rica. I've seen frogs in Costa Rica and in Hawaii, but the same thing remains true with everyone I've talked to, whether they've seen bombates or whether they're going and seeing
Yep.
cryptic frogs, anything, they will be out every morning in the sun sunning themselves,
Yep.
and then they'll be at the end of the day when the heat's starting to die down back out in the sun. So 2
Yeah.
times a day, so probably 4 hours a day, they're sunning themselves. I've never experienced it until I kept large form Ophaga. I had redheads, and when I added UV, they would go to the very top of the tank
Yep.
as high up as they could, and they would sit under it. And at first, I didn't think anything of it. They would just be
Yeah.
up there. Then I started noticing them laying down, almost with their
Yeah.
heads touching, like they're actually.
Maximizing surface area, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and that's when it kinda hit my brain, well, maybe we're missing something, and
Yeah.
there is, I think, a guy I just met recently in the last year or 2, I'm running his lights, Colby Jingles, he owns Thrive.
Okay.
He's actually developing something right now, but UV is something that you can get. You can get UV bulbs, the problem is,
Right.
where do you place them? So a
Where do you
lot of people
place
don't
them?
understand that you're gonna do it on your vent, or you're gonna, it's not gonna
Or you're going to
penetrate the
get what
glass
what
we
was it?
use.
Starfire glass or Solacryl that
Exactly,
actually doesn't block UVB.
exactly.
And then do you run them all? Brent was running them all day because his whole philosophy was how much exposure are they getting at any point in the tank, but also then when they're under the light, but then all the times they're not going to be directly under the light to get hit. And so he thought, well, I'll just leave it on and they'll regulate as they need to
I'm
nutritionally. But
curious if it's, somebody, now that we do have Tesoro's bringing legally collected large obligates in, there's been an issue, and the issue has been that there's quite a few different frog species that have had the coloration loss. So you've got
yeah,
things like Lamani. I think the red Lamani are one of the biggest ones. People can't
yeah.
keep that lustrous red color. Some frogs are true to their color. Like I have red Vicenti. I don't think I could turn the lights on for the rest of their lives and they would still be red. But there are some
Yeah,
frogs that I've kept personally with large amounts of carotenoids. They have the colors remained, but that
yeah,
is something that I would wonder if somebody would be willing to try that with red Lamani and some of these frogs they have trouble with, running the UV, giving them the carotenoid supplements,
yeah,
and seeing if it does bolster the color. Maybe that's the missing link. I feel like these conversations are important, but
yeah.
these, for some reason, they just keep getting lost in time, and it's like, this isn't a hard thing to do. We're talking about like, now the prices of lighting have come down. You'll probably pick up
Oh my gosh,
a
right?
UVB bulb for $30 and throw it
Can
on
you
your
remember?
tanks
Do
that
you
are
remember
under.
in like 1998, 1999, how much a metal halide bulb costs for a reef tank? I think it was
Or
like over a
what
hundred
about when
bucks
they
for a
first came
bulb,
out with
man.
OSHA bulbs?
Right? Yeah. And then don't touch it or it's going to burn your
No,
fingerprints off. I mean, it was
vent it
just
out
like,
your window.
yeah.
I've
And
actually
don't look at it, you'll go blind. Like it was like
I've
the stuff we
actually
were doing.
there's still plenty of zoological that are still running metal halides on their dart frog enclosures,
And they're
because
probably doing really well. Like,
they're doing
and
amazing,
that's,
because it's
and I think this,
LED is getting there. It's still not
yeah,
100% perfect. You
no,
can't get, because the spectrums are separate chips.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
not blending them. I mean, they'll say RBG, but RBG is made up of every individual bulb.
But they do it, they also do it for display, what looks good rather than, I mean, the big thing with, 6,700 Kelvin or 6,500 Kelvin is the color temperature of the tropical sun at noonday. And everything, we skew everything blue and white to be pleasing to our eyes, and it's
Yeah.
just not where a lot of these things, live and what they're under.
Biotope enthusiasts, I feel like, are doing a good job of keeping
Yeah.
the naturalistic approach alive, because nothing is worse. And I'm very glad. And we probably shouldn't even talk about itenic lighting, or else people will start putting on their dart frog tanks like the reef tank. But
Yeah,
it's been a
right.
pet peeve of mine.
Uh,
I say, unless you're keeping an NPS tank at depth,
yeah, yeah.
a deep water tank, when is the
Yes.
water ever this blue?
Right.
It
Never.
only gets
Never.
blue the further sunlight can't penetrate. No,
Yes, right?
so there's no need for this. So it's the same thing goes with reptiles. What would the Saharan desert sun look like in a tank? Would it look
Right.
cool light,
Yeah.
or
And to
would
be
it?
honest, when you see corals in the wild, a lot of them are kind of brown.
Well,
They're
100,
not
100%.
they're not
Well,
glowing mint green.
they're not getting fed mass amounts of potassium and
Right? Right?
all these trace
Yeah.
elements that are very minuscule in the wild, or they're just not getting the same sun penetration that they do 24/7 in this
Yeah.
perfect environment. I feel like maybe they went over and beyond and we didn't in the dart frog hobby, because I think that the first thing that should have happened was we need to nail down these supplementations, because I think supplements are so important, and I think it's getting really good. I think we've got the powder down
Yep.
to fine powder, which, you remember, the old powders were
Oh,
extremely, they were more,
yeah.
I think they were developed for more like, I think the first one that I ever got a hold of that really did well with amphibians was for chameleons, a more sensitive species.
Yeah, yeah. Because
Prior
there
to
was a bigger
that, I
market. There was a
mean,
bigger market for chameleons and fish and birds.
prior to
Yeah.
that, I used to have to take a fork and break it apart and get it fine, or you'd have to sieve it through a flour sieve.
Or
It
we
was
had
sick
used
for
like, and then
flies.
we'd sprinkle in Hungarian sweet paprika to
Yeah.
like potentially get, maybe this is going to add red coloration, but it had
This
to be
is that
sweet paprika. It couldn't be
y
the spicy paprika.
you're talking about stuff that I forgot all about that was
Oh
just
my
so
gosh, and
funny.
this was like cutting edge at the time, which is
110%.
why, again, going back to why I think I'm having a hard time with my relationship with the hobby right now and where it's at, is that those aren't the conversations being had, and it's this it even goes back to, I remember going to a show and someone was like, "Well, do you have any pairs for sale?" And they go, I don't buy any frogs unless they're pairs. It's a waste of money." And I was like, the idea in 2004 that you could get a proven pair of frogs, like, you would never buy less than 3 frogs, because with 3 frogs, not knowing what they are, that's a 75% chance of getting a male and female. You are always buying groups of frogs and then trying to parse out the male and female to breed. That's just how it was, you know? And, but again, the conversations that would happen that would go beyond that were when we would get together and it was after the vendor show and we're all in the hotel and we've all had a few beers. And then it's like, so I saw this thing one time in Peru and I noticed the frogs were doing this. Or it's, you know, I keep trying to breed him, but I keep getting SLS. And someone's like, well, I breed that frog and I don't get SLS. And then they're comparing when we got together and there was more of that sense of community, that's when those conversations happened, that those, what became kind of innovative experiments came out of, that now has just become standard in the hobby.
For
right?
people that don't know what SLS
Yeah,
is,
who didn't,
spindly
who aren't
leg
old
syndrome.
geezers telling people to, you know, get off my lawn. You know,
Yeah.
people who come to it new don't realize that's where it started.
Yeah.
Even when you talked about, you know, the new products that are coming out for the dart frog hobby, I didn't think in terms of products because there weren't products.
No.
We had to go to the fish store and jerry rig fish store stuff with whatever we could get at Home Depot because there wasn't an industry and business built around it. It was literally a hobby.
I don't think until people started realizing from, you know, like, well, maybe this is me personally, but I have talked to other people that kind of were the same way in the early 2000s, late 90s. I don't think people realized how far advanced the Europeans were at that time because it was the first time I picked up an article and saw an advertisement for multiple products that you could buy on the shelf. It was the first time I saw lighting that was,
Yep.
was specific, specific for dendros. The first time
Yep.
I saw calcium powder, the first time I think it was the first time I saw people using vitamin A. We were doing vitamin A, but they were mixing it into the calcium, and then
Yep.
we found out that caused issues.
Right. They don't fully metabolize if they're together, so you got to separate it out.
Yep.
But then we found out, which we didn't find out. I think we've surmised that they're potentially able to metabolize it better with UVB. And that's
I think that might be a
yeah.
missing link that
And so it's not
Yeah.
UVB that's magic. They're able to metabolize vitamin A better, which and frogs need for breeding. But then we talk about breeding. We're just constantly breeding frogs all the time. And Ed Kowalski even talked about this. Our frogs kind of stunted and smaller because we're making them start breeding younger than they might in the wild. And once an animal starts needing to breed, it's got to put energy that would have otherwise gone to growth into creating young. And so maybe the reason we don't have these tinctorius is because we're trying to get these tinctorius to breed as soon as possible after we've right. So there's all these things that come down to understanding the life cycle and natural history of this animal as much as possible to you know, keep it as best we can in captivity.
There's been a weird phenomenon that's been happening throughout a lot of hobbies that I've noticed, and you know, I'm not an expert. I don't claim to be, but what I've noticed in multiple hobbies I've been involved with is that there's something that always goes on. You have people that enter the hobby, especially when I started in the dendro hobby and in the marine hobby,
Yeah.
as figures that can get up and say this is how it is, or like more of like an authority figure. So herpetologist, biologist, scientist. And I feel like along with what you said earlier about this boom in the online world, you got people that are coming out now, and I'm not going to nail down everybody because there's a lot of good going out of it too, because it's easier for us to talk. But a lot of these people have been pushed out of the hobby, and it's due to people coming up that have a better, I guess, more influence on people, more followers, whatever. They say their opinion. They get into a fight with somebody that is working at the zoo that's been, you know, in situ dealing other stuff, and they've been pushing them out.
What do you know?
And this is the reason you have things like what I think you have, things like Reef Retreat and places where people just want to come and talk to scientists and talk to people that they can get more information from that have been dealing with this on more of a scientific level. And I feel like that's how you have breakouts. And I feel like the breakout period
Yeah.
happens, then you have like this it comes in ebbs and flows. I feel like I got
Yeah.
involved in this particular hobby when it was breaking out. It was
Yeah.
everything was new. Azurius were like hundreds of dollars, and it was like everything was new. It was prior to you guys developing like the in situ tanks and like something that's like revolutionizing the world, and it was all blowing up. And then
It
when
was all
everyone
and it was all discovery and learning,
yeah,
right?
and then when
Yeah, it was like,
everyone
"Oh, man."
and then once everyone had just enough, they just
Yes.
pushed it all away, like, "No, we've got enough." And it's like, "No, we need to keep going.
It
It needs to
became
keep the
it became what I've
conversations can't
called,
stop."
yeah, a care sheet hobby, right? Where we've now we've codified everything. And to be
You can't
successful with
do
this.
you can't have the reef safe list.
Right,
It
right,
it
right.
it's
Yeah.
just all these are starting points. Like, I could
Yes.
give you a starting point. Don't keep tinks in more than 1.1s, or, there's all these things that we have these little rules that are gonna help you. But there's so much more that we need to figure out, and
There's
I and then
so much
people
more.
people can't be complacent and be like, "This is where it ends," and we've gotten as far as we can because I took a 6-year hiatus, and you know this, I moved from the West Coast out to the East Coast. I took
Yeah.
a 6-year hiatus, got back in, and, immediately started tracing back some frogs I wanna keep. My whole plan was to build another frog room, get back into the hobby, maybe not the same level, I don't need hundreds of vivariums, but,
Yep.
something. And
Yep.
just doing that, trying to trace back some of the Pamilio I used to keep, I find out that a whole mess of them are completely gone. And I start racking my brain because I'm thinking, well, the hobby isn't massive. There isn't billions
No.
of people in the US keeping them, but I'm like,
No.
there was a lot of these. A lot of them came in. We were successfully breeding them. How does one locality or morph leave the hobby in under 6 years? And that's what I start thinking, like, something needs to change, and the conversations need to be had because, of course, some frogs will never leave the hobby. They breed very
Right.
well,
Yeah.
they're extremely hardy, but at the same token, you don't need to stop there. It's always about progression, like, I wanna learn everything I can. That's why I never wanna be an authority figure because there's people that make this their whole lives, that they
Right.
can be the authority figures.
And I think what I saw happen, I'd say over probably the last 15 years is as social media and online engagement became more and more the community and the way people interacted, the people who really just wanted this to be a hobby because it's something they were interested in, those people don't want to spend their days fighting with other people on the internet, on social media that they don't know and who doesn't know them and the investment they've put in and literally what they know from experience, not because they read a bunch of posts on Facebook, right? Their knowledge and their experience came from, I said, if you want to, I've told people to this and they always give me a weird look and I say, the best frog keepers I know have probably killed more frogs than anyone I know because that's people talk, they come over and see all the plants at my house. Man, how are you so good at keeping plants? And I
'Cause
said,
I
because I've killed a lot of
killed
them.
a lot of 'em.
I mean, just the body count of frogs that really good frog keepers have because they had to learn. And each one of those things was like, okay, that's not working. Even building enclosures. Oh, they managed to get through that gap. Holy crap. That's not a good design thing. All of that built that hobby. And those people who are interested in that, like I said, are not interested in getting in a fight in a Facebook comment section. And so I think that's how we lose them because that's not fun for them.
Well, you
They don't
brought up
have to
you
position
just now
themselves as a personality or business.
You just
They
brought up a really good point that I didn't even think of, probably not even knowing you did, and that's that it is very hard to write a book on just how to keep these frogs. It's easy to say that, step by step, but there is something that I see a lot is people will get into this hobby and they'll say, "Hey, you know, Facebook friends, how do I keep these animals? And everyone will give them,
Right.
your basic steps, which you can read in a
Yeah.
book and you can get online, you can research that. But what you can't do is when it comes to the plants in particulars, say, this is exactly how you do it. Somebody asked me the other day, they said, what's your misting schedule? And I said, well, not the same as it's going to be for you. And they said, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, how is what I keep in my room is only dedicated by what temperature I keep my room, and there's so many variables, it would be so hard for me to tell you what to do. I can tell you how I got to the point where it works for me, but again, I killed a lot of stuff to
Killed a
figure that
lot of
out.
stuff.
There's a
Even fruit fly cultures. The issues I have with my fruit fly cultures in a dry, arid place is not the same issues someone is having 2 hours west on the other side of the Cascades in Seattle, simply because of humidity, temperature, everything that's involved. So I have a hard time with them drying out, and on the other side, they're going to be too soupy, and so it's just a different mold. All of that. We can say here's some generalities, here's some truisms, but you know, I am convinced every Restrepia orchid I've ever been given, was on its last legs, and that's why they gave them to me. I love that orchid. I would love to grow that orchid in a vivarium. I have killed more Restrepia than anybody I know. But then people will send me, people in San Diego or even in Seattle will send me photos every year of their blooming Restrepia orchids in their vivarium. I'm like, how are
I
you doing
I
this?
think
I can't do it.
I think the first time I went over to Todd Kelly and Christina's house, I remember
Yeah.
walking into the, living room, and they had just I think it was the second no, maybe it was the first go around of the big vivarium, and I'll add a picture, and I asked Todd, I'm looking in this vivarium, and I see all the Versia bromeliads and,
Yeah, yeah,
just this
yeah.
lush floor full of Saginella, and
Bulbophyllums.
I looked at him and I said, "What frog species are you keeping in there?" And he looked at me and he said, "None." And I said, "Well, this is the most beautiful vivarium I've ever seen. Why would you not have any frog species?"
And I
And he
don't
said,
think you'll show a picture of it, the sheer size of this thing.
"I know, I got a picture of him standing next to it."
Yeah,
But
okay.
at that point, he says, I can't keep frogs in here." I said, "Why?" He's like, "Because none of these plants would be alive." Because he's got fans, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a fan in a vivarium,
Yeah,
and I'm like, "What would you ever need a fan for? That orchid? That orchid?"
yeah, yeah. And they're
It's
only gonna
like
be okay as long as they're that distance away from that fan, right? But and if I put them lower in the tank, they're just gonna, like, rot because it's too much moisture. They've gotta dry out. But then I also remember someone saying anecdotally, if you can create a vivarium that orchids grow in well, dart frogs are also going to do well in it, right? If something that's when you talk about even in situ, even in a rainforest, it doesn't rain all the time, and when the sun comes out, it dries up pretty quick, and it's not because of air movement. It's just hot and it's intense, and stuff starts to dry out, and so that's a challenge in a captive environment to dry out a tank. We're gonna have to use air movement. We're gonna have to
yeah.
regulate how much water and misting we use.
I think that and that's a I was talking with Troy Goldberg, I think about a year ago about this and
Mhm.
how, we both came to an understanding at some point in keeping dart frogs, thinking not and this isn't just a breeding thing, this is more of a, like, just the way it probably should be, and people should start adopting this, is we've been going through, like, the seasonal, changes, like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna run my tank wet now and
Yep.
dry now, which also in turns gives the females maybe a smaller break. It's never gonna keep them from breeding. I mean, if you give them
Yeah.
cups of water, they're gonna
Right.
keep breeding, but I do notice a slowdown, a regression in that. I do notice a little bit of plant die-off, with some plants doing better, but I
Yep.
feel like that's something that's important
And
that
that's
also
succession, right? That's gonna happen.
but
Yeah.
it also I think it all ties in together, when we're trying to recreate this, it's the same thing that, why we've had so many leaps and bounds in the reefing hobby is people started saying, "Hey, we need to start adding moon cycles so we can have coral spawn or
Right, right,
have
exactly.
certain fish breed," and now they're breeding
Let's
crazy
simulate
fish.
tides. Let's do
It makes me
I mean,
wonder
what was
how
it? What was
yeah.
The Bornman surge device, which was basically replicating a toilet tank,
Yep,
to surge water through the
yep,
corals. And but this too is, I think, too, and the reef keeping hobby has a side of this. It's just not how I roll. Is there is a gadget side, and it's
yep.
the tinkering. And I say that to say what that can lead. In some ways, this has been really good. Is that we can start automating everything, but I think what that does sometimes is create distance for us to really look at it and observe what's going on. The last time I talked to Mark Pepper, he's still hand misting and hand spraying every single one of the frog tanks at his
Phil at
facility.
Dartden is doing the same thing,
And
and
I bought a misting system I've been in this hobby for a long time now. I bought my first misting system 3 years ago, and I can't say my tank is doing better.
no.
It was for the big one because I thought I'm gonna have a real tank, and I can't say it's doing better because I'm not looking at it as much because I know it's getting misted regularly.
I do both. I run the
Yeah.
mister for me is me being lazy, first and
Assurance.
foremost.
Yeah.
Like, right now, I'm in Montreal at our second home,
Yeah.
and the mister's going back there, everything's fine.
Yes.
But what I do notice is once you have an established tank, unless it is set up, maybe smaller tanks, I think I've had more success with. When you get bigger systems, I feel like I'm missing. I can never mist enough. It's
Yeah.
always there's certain areas and I never can get a correct balance. I'm
So
either missing
that's
too
when you're
much or too
spraying it.
less.
Yeah.
I
And I remember
secondarily miss.
when I installed my nozzle heads and I sent a photo to Todd and I was like, "How's this look?" And he goes, "Good." And you will now spend the rest of your life micro adjusting those nozzles
Yep.
because as plants
Um,
grow, they're going to block stuff underneath, and now
yep.
you got to
I
overcompensate.
set it, forget it, and I hand miss the rest of the time. I don't do it as much, but it
Yeah.
definitely and here's one that'll probably blow your mind because you'll probably remember this from early talks. There was a guy, I think he passed away now. He used to live in Oregon. It was a herpetologist I met. And when I went and first saw him, and this would have been in 2003-ish, 4-ish, I'd
Yeah.
never even seen a Pamilio in a home, vivarium. He was hand misting his systems, and I asked him why. I said, "Why haven't you bought one of these new Mist Kings coming out of from Marty over in Canada or wherever they're coming from?" And
Oh yeah, yeah.
he's like, "Well, I can't." And I said, "Well, why can't you?" He's like, "I've already tried it. They get clogged up." And I'm like, "Well, you're running RO water. How would they get clumped up?" He's like, "Well, I use black water extract." And I
Oh
was like,
wow.
"Black water extract? Why would you use
Yeah.
black water extract?" He's like, "Because it's antimicrobial. It mimics the habitat of the tadpoles. That's why everyone, when they're raising up tadpoles, puts the leaves in there and stuff." He was literally brewing leaves on a teapot. This is before I think even some of the black water extract fish tank brands
Yeah.
started
Yeah.
making
Oh
it
yeah,
already
yeah, yeah,
made.
yeah.
He was
Oh yeah.
brewing them on the stove. His whole house smelled
Oh,
like it.
I would boil oak leaves and alder cones and
Yeah.
stuff that I would gather myself and boil that and put it in my big tadpole
So
rearing
his
tubs.
big backpack mister that he'd go around misting all the tanks,
Oh my
it was
gosh.
literally brown. You could barely see through it. It looked just like my Amazonian freshwater tank at home that's black water.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
it never and that's what I started. I've done it ever since. I've always
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know why, but one thing I do notice is I never have I always hear this people always talking about mold outbreaks. I get a little bit of
In their
mold.
tank?
Yeah, in the tank. It's like
Okay.
it's almost like it's
Like a
like
slime mold?
silk. No, 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 no. It's more like
Oh.
silk, almost like white fuzzy mold.
Oh, got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's
Fungus
nothing
kind of
big. It doesn't
yeah,
affect
mold.
nothing, but people
Yeah.
talk about that. And
Yeah.
when I started switching to this, I never got it again. It's just
Oh, yeah.
like this is something springtails can get take care of. But I just notice maybe it's just me and my brain. But he always told me is like with all the Pamilio I kept, I never had as many tadpole loss and certain things like that because he would literally and this is also why I hand mist. I will flush the bromeliads every once in a while and I will add
Yeah.
water to the bromeliads.
I do too. I do too.
The misters will
Yeah.
never do that.
I take the thing off the top, I'm spraying, I take it off the top and I'll fill and sort of discharge the whole bromeliad thing until I feel like it's
Yep.
probably run clean and then do that for all of them just to kind of refresh it.
Something about seeing like a lot of scat on the leaves from the
Yeah.
frogs too. Like I'm sure it doesn't, I'm not worried about it, but something about that just makes it like
Well, what
go ahead and freshen her up. It
what
doesn't
I
need to look
do,
like
and
a
this now we're
bathroom.
getting into the weird hobby stuff we do because Brent lived in Montana and he would go out and he'd found like deer poop or elk poop, and he'd get the pellets, and he would like smush them into the plant roots on the back of his vivarium as fertilizer, and he would just like start smearing. He told me this one time, and so now what I do is every time I find like poop on the glass or on a bromeliad or on a leaf, I take it and I'll just like smear it on the roots of plants that don't necessarily look like the leaves are getting a little yellow or something. Probably a nitrogen deficiency because I don't have like an organic substrate. These days I'm just using foam, um, and I'll just start smearing frog poop like on the roots of all the plants just to give them a little extra boost.
Well, again, not to keep mentioning him, but Alex Menke over at Frog Daddy, he works with a guy that he came up with, and you have to look into this. You have to go to the site. I think it's
Okay.
frogdaddy.com or net. You'll have to go look him up. He has got a product on there, and it is a fertilizer, and it is based off of, if people don't know this, a lot of people don't. I didn't know this until I think I
Yeah.
watched like one of the Nat Geo specials or something. But
Yeah.
I guess the winds pick up the sands in like places like Saudi Arabia, these
Oh,
big desert areas,
in the Sahara, and
and
then it
blow
goes over the
in.
Atlantic.
It's
Yeah.
literally what fertilizes the whole entire Amazon.
Yeah.
And so they based a fertilizer based off of what that makeup should essentially look like, and they
Interesting.
sell it.
Interesting.
I've used it, I took it, and I
Yeah.
sprinkled it all over my tank. I don't know if it
Yeah.
did anything. I have no idea. I didn't have a control. It would be better if I had a
Well, and that's the thing.
control.
So much of what we figured out was anecdotal. It was like, well, I think, and then we would try it out, and sometimes it would work, and other times the frogs would,
Yeah,
didn't do well.
they're also doing, a couple different, I can't remember the product, it's pH something. It's a little tablet, it's a gel tab, you just snap in half and dump into your water, and it liquefies, and it doesn't, create any clogs in your misters, or you can hand spray it, and
Oh, okay.
it's also a safe fertilizer for plants.
Okay.
They've got
Mm.
the breakdown of it, you can look it
Right.
up on there, but there are a lot of products coming out. I don't know how beneficial they are. I hope they are. I hope that people just keep coming out with these, because
Yeah.
the marine hobby is uh, a great hobby to look at, how they've gone from
Yes.
undergravel
Yeah.
filters to protein skimmers, and things that have revolutionized it. I think the
Yeah.
frog hobby is due for that. I think in situ was a great step. You guys, coming up with that design between all of you guys.
And I
Uh,
will say, as far as in situ, I was in charge of the branding and that initial marketing launch, but a lot of that design was Bill, the founder, and what he saw and what he needed and his background
yeah,
in engineering. So yeah, it's always like the next step. What's the next step? How
yeah.
do we improve on the next thing? How do we keep improving? And for me, knowing what and where we need to improve, as weird as it sounds, comes down to picking poop off the glass and putting it on plants. Because when I'm doing that, I'm looking around in the tank. I'm checking things out in a different way than if I'm just standing back or sitting on the couch looking at it. I'm actually looking like, oh, okay, this back corner that I don't look in is actually stuff's building up and it's not looking good, or this plant's doing really well, and then realizing there's a frog that hunkers out underneath it all the time, and so it's just fertilizing that plant on its own, and then realizing, okay, where do I need to get more air movement, or where is there not going to be light because this plant's getting big, or is moisture moving through the substrate okay? It's all of that stuff that doesn't happen until I open up the doors and literally just put my head in, and check things out.
Yeah. No, I think all these topics we're bringing up are super important, and I hope other people have these discussions. And
Me too.
because it's amazing that, well, obviously your memory is a hell of a lot better than mine, because I keep forgetting. But it's amazing that we're bringing up things that happened, decades ago now, that are still relevant, and probably should be more relevant, because I think things like UV, things like different feeding habits, and all these talks on just biotopes in general
Yeah.
is we less about breeding, more about, let's just keep the frogs healthy, I think, is the main objective here.
Yeah.
But
So anyways, yeah, that's yeah, where I'm at. I think there's things we still haven't figured out. And there was even, my last time, the last couple times I've been in Peru, I didn't see a single dart frog. And I didn't go to see, I was in dart frog areas, but I didn't go out of my way to go find them, because once I was in that habitat, when you are in the Amazon, right? And from here to the Atlantic coast, this elevation is barely dropping by 300 feet. That this thing is so massive and so huge, and in the midst of it is this tiny little frog that could fit on my thumbnail. And I know it's up there, and it's up in the canopy, or it's around here, and I can hear it. I think what I realized is it's enough for me just to be here where it is. I don't need to add it to a list of things I've seen, because that can become its own type of collection. And that's great for the people who love doing that. The reason I go places is because there is, like I talked about with granulifera. I want to go see granulifera, but what I saw were these like pre-montane Costa Rican rainforests that are still probably my favorite. And those are completely different rainforests than Peruvian rainforests. And I'll say in around Tarapoto, which is a little higher up, those are totally different rainforests than when you get to Iquitos, or further south in like Puerto Maldonado. Like they're just the elevation, the plants, the species, the diversity of species, that all shifts and changes. And I think as I've gotten older and I go to places where there are dart frogs, that's not even a priority, because I'm like, oh, look at that assemblage of epiphytes growing together. And the fact that this one plant here started collecting leaf litter and moss, became a substrate for these 4 other plants that are growing out of the base of it. Like, how do I recreate that? And going back to what Todd said, there aren't any frogs in here, because if there were, the plants would die. I gotta, it's like,
That's one thing I do miss about the Pacific Northwest. I remember so many times living at up on Mount St. Helens,
yeah,
walking out there in our area where we lived out in the national wildlife area up there, and seeing the epiphytic ferns growing on there in a temperate rainforest, and being like, this is so mind blowing.
yeah,
When I finally got down south and saw it, it's like the Pacific Northwest on steroids. I'd never
oh,
seen so
yeah,
many different plant species growing on limbs of trees. There was more, I mean, because everything has to grow in the canopy because there's
yep,
next to no sunlight on the ground.
yeah,
So it's so unbelievable, like what grows down there. And then, like you said, you've got this frog that can fit on your pinky nail, hopping
yeah,
around the leaf litter, and
yeah,
you can hear it, but you can't see it. You spend all
right,
day looking for one frog. I think the next time, I think we're thinking of going to Panama at some point, and I think that
nice,
trip is
nice,
going to be, obviously we will see frogs, but it's going to be to just take it in, because I feel like when I do go do these herping adventures, I spend more time looking at one thing and not taking in everything. And as the older I get, I feel like I need to step
yeah,
back and kind of take it all in, because sometimes you only get to see this once in your life. And,
right, right. And
all,
that's what I feel like I'm getting better at, is I want to take it all in, right?
well, I
I
feel
want to see.
that my best thing I've told people is when they've asked me, like, "How is it diving?" When I used to collect
Yep,
in,
yep,
for public aquariums, marine life, and I did the majority of that in Oregon and Seattle, in the Sound and down in Oregon, and they would say, "Oh, the diving must be amazing," and I would tell them that 90% of the diving was in poop brown water where I could only
yep,
see about my hand in front of my face, and I was looking at one animal. And the sad part is and I have had some dives, after we had been collecting, but the sad part
yeah,
is the majority of that small 10% window when we had a clear dive, we'd either be in the Straits of Juan de Fuca or Hood Canal or something where we'd
yeah.
have a clear day. I would still be looking for that one
You're
little
still looking
frog.
for the one
The
thing.
one little frog, where
But that's
I'm
where,
I can't see the
yeah.
sea or all the beauty around me. It's just that one little frog, you know?
The last time I was in southern Peru is like, gosh, maybe 2 years now, year and a half. 2 years ago now. I wasn't, herps weren't out. The things I was there to look for, frogs and reptiles, and they weren't out. I couldn't find them, but I ended up going into a stream with a little pool and catching with my bare hands killifish, out of
Amazing.
this pool. And I'm like, I never would have noticed those or thought to get down in the stream if I'd been finding the thing I came to see, right? And so when you kind of like track away from that and decide to like take it all in, and you see something darting around in a pool that's 2 inches deep, um, and realize, oh my gosh, these are killifish. This is again this crazy looking colorful fish in this ephemeral-ish pool in the middle of the Amazon. How many people are going to be able to see that? And so the fact that we have these things in our homes that the average person doesn't know exists, or doesn't think about, I just think that's a really cool thing. And I would hate to see the hobby lose that awe,
Yeah.
if it just became all about the business and all about the clout and all about the whatever. I think we have to maintain and retain a sense of that awe and mystery for these things,
Well,
which
I'm gonna
ultimately is the planet we live on.
I'm gonna keep an open mind to think that it is going to keep going in a good direction, and I'm also gonna like hopefully we'll see another microcosm. I'd love to see something like that in the future. And I know you at this point getting back in
Yeah.
reconnecting with a lot of people, that conversations never left the table. I still to this day not only have talked to people that have been, but people that wish they could or would like to see it happen. Hopefully, maybe I don't know. That's all in your court, but hopefully that's
We'll have to
something.
see. We'll have to see. I think once the pandemic hit, and then we tried to get through that, and then coming back out of it, it was, and then life and all those things, and it being a side thing, it was a volunteer thing. It was like, okay, let's table this. But yeah, maybe there's room for something in the future to again
I
celebrate
think
the
a
hobby and the
non-vendor
community component.
I think a non-vendor related,
Yeah,
maybe just, I like the idea of donating, with a, what do you call it? Like a raffle system,
yeah,
donation with a raffle system to go towards a organization, I think is way better than, I can go shopping online. That's another thing. Online now, we
right.
don't need to do that. I know there's a place for this too. You've got American
Yeah,
Frog
right.
Day and
Exactly.
other things. I think that this is something I was talking to Julio about, and some other people, how nice it would be to have something that is just academic based,
Yeah,
you know.
I'll be thinking about it. We'll see.
Even
We'll
if
see
even
if
even
we
if
could
even if the
resurrect.
first microcosm that came back was an online thing, like a
Yeah.
virtual, you know.
Oh, yeah. Right.
That was a one the during COVID, that's what Macna did, was a virtual Macna.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Because
Interesting.
people couldn't be around each other or whatever that was going
Yeah.
on,
Yeah.
so, I
Yeah.
mean, could be
Mm,
something. I mean, that could wrap a lot more people
yeah.
around it. Maybe it
I
would be
think
like
the in-person thing does help for it. It's
it
questions and
does.
dialogue, right? Because there's a serendipitousness to it that you suddenly think of something that you wouldn't have because someone said something, which then causes a question, and what happens in that environment, I think, can't be replicated.
Unless we all buy the same beer and
Right?
all drink it
Right.
online at the same
We
time.
we all get 2 or 3 in,
Yeah.
and then it's just a massive group call. Yeah, then maybe we could recreate it. But,
Well, hey, Ron,
yeah,
man, I really enjoyed our conversation, and
I
hopefully,
did
we could
too.
circle back. I've
Let's
got
do it.
I got quite a few people on the list for this year already and into next year, but I'd like to circle back and have you back on again. And
Cool, let's do it.
if you have anything, if microcosms ends up coming back up again, that rolls around, then we'll definitely have you on.
Cool.
And hopefully we can have another conversation again sometime soon.
Let's do it. Thanks for having
Well,
me on.
yeah, I appreciate it, man. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
Hey, this is Josh Groves with the Poison Podcast. If you enjoyed watching today's episode, please do me a huge favor and like and subscribe to our YouTube and Facebook pages. You can also find us at Poisoned NY on YouTube and Poison Podcast on Facebook. Hope you can join me on the next episode coming out soon.